You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Inslee.
Returning to the show today is Will Porter. Will is a staff writer at RT. Basically, Will covers a lot of foreign policy over there. And then, a few more fun stories too every week, but a lot of great stuff. And he comes on the show every Monday to talk about some of the most important stuff that he's been writing over there. Make sure that if you like these Monday episodes, don't miss one, because a lot of what me and Will are covering on today's show are the stories that we've talked about in the past. So make sure you're subscribing to the show and checking out all of our work. A lot of it has been posted in the past at antiwar.com. We have a shared byline at Consortium News and also at the Libertarian Institute. So, Will, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Kyle. Thanks for having me back. How you doing?
I'm doing well, and excited to have you back on today's show because, as I said in the intro there, we're covering a lot of the same stories that we've been covering this whole time and how they developed. And it seems like time and time again, Will, that a lot of the insights that we had and a lot of the things we're thinking, man, this coronavirus is really going to be an issue on the Navy ships. Well, we're definitely going to see that's the case. But one of the big stories that I have to update on today's episode is the one that last Monday's episode was headlined on, and that was this crazy coup attempt in Venezuela. So, Will, I don't know if you can maybe start with just a brief intro on what that coup attempt was the U.S. government involved, and then give us the updates. And everybody, if you haven't, make sure you go back and listen to last Monday's episode. You'll have all the little details of who's who and why that happened. But go ahead, Will.
Yeah, sure. So, just to kind of recap some of what we discussed last time, if people aren't totally familiar with this crazy plot. So a few weeks ago now, you had this American private security company, Silvercorp USA, and the Venezuelan opposition trying to carry out some kind of small-scale invasion or something with 60 or 62 mercenaries. And two of these guys were Americans. It was mostly local defectors from the military and the National Guard there in Venezuela. And this plot miserably failed. 8 people, I think, were killed in when the security forces, stopped them. A couple dozen of these guys have now been arrested, including the 2 Americans, and they've now been charged with terrorism and conspiracy and a few other things. And apparently the plan here was to capture an airport in Caracas, the capital city, kidnap the president, Nicolas Maduro, and then fly him back to the U.S., where he's been indicted on narcotics charges and where there's a $15 million bounty for information on him. But I guess arresting him would be, good enough for that, would be even better. And so most of this has been admitted to directly by the CEO of this company, Silvercorp, a guy named Jordan Goudreau. And then some of it has also come out in some of the reporting. We have these documents, for example, showing this agreement between Silvercorp and the opposition. And Goudreau doesn't deny those documents at all, but he does say that the opposition never actually paid up and that, he went through with this crazy mission anyway. So that's kind of a weird part of the story.
Right. And just to jump in here, one of the oddest parts of this story I find is how open Jordan Goudreau has been about, his company's role here, especially since it was such a failure. But I saw he even took an interview with the Gray Zone's Anya Parampil, who, they do great work over at the Gray Zone. But, if you look up, their coverage of Venezuela, at times I would say is pro-Maduro. A lot of it is just really good journalism, but at times it does definitely favor Maduro. And they're very sympathetic to him. So I'm not sure, what is he like? I can imagine him maybe taking some, interview with Anderson Cooper to push his official narrative, something that's very scripted and well planned out. But taking an interview with Anya Parampil, that's definitely brave on his part. And I'm not trying to say hey, don't talk to legitimate media, but it seems like, just there are so many parts of this story that don't really seem right or things that would typically happen.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, this guy, he was like, I think some of the Americans on this mission were like tweeting about it as they were like on the speedboats and stuff out there to do it. This Jordan Goudreau guy appeared in a video that he like leaked to I think a media outlet announcing the mission on the day of it. So it's kind of weird. He does seem very like almost too willing to speak to the press. Like, like you said, even giving an interview to the Gray Zone. So that's, kind of odd about this guy. And the fact that he decided to carry out this mission apparently without being paid, as he claims. He says the opposition never went through with paying him, but he still decided to do it. We kind of talked last time about like this guy's personality, or what personality he might have based on some of what his colleagues have said, that he's kind of like might have some kind of delusions of grandeur or something, that he's some freedom fighter or something. But either way, you're right. There's a lot of like mysterious stuff about this Goudreau guy. And he's also been claiming too that he had no backing from Washington, from the U.S. government for this mission. And I don't think there's been any like great evidence for U.S. involvement still. Something that we missed, or that I missed last week, are these documents that the Military Times got a hold of. And it's basically this like promo literature that Goudreau would be handing out to investors while he's trying to like raise money for this mission and pitch it. And the most interesting thing on this document, I think, is that it lists Keith Schiller, Donald Trump's bodyguard, as a senior advisor to the project. And so, that might provide some kind of link to the administration. As we explained last time, the Associated Press had a story saying that Goudreau had been introduced to the Venezuelan opposition in the first place through the Schiller guy, through Trump's bodyguard. And that, he had tagged along with Schiller on meetings with opposition people, where I think Schiller was kind of playing this like informal behind the scenes role to trying to coordinating things between the administration and the opposition. But the AP version has it that, Schiller had decided that Goudreau wasn't trustworthy or competent or something and cut off contact with him. But, that Goudreau at that point had already made his own connections with the opposition and kept meeting with them on his own. However, this document that's released by the Military Times suggests that Schiller was actually part of this plot, that he was still in contact. He was a senior advisor to this whole project. Now, of course, I think it's perfectly possible that, based on some of this other stuff we know about this Goudreau guy, I think it's possible that he slapped Schiller's name on this document just to make himself kind of look good and to convince investors that, hey, this is a very high level project. It's got all these important people attached to it. Here, look, here's Donald Trump's bodyguard, all this kind of stuff. It was on the letterhead of this big this consulting firm in Washington. So like Goudreau might have been trying to kind of like, beef up his credentials a little bit with these names. And something I should include, too, is the Military Times does quote somebody that's apparently close to this Schiller guy, who basically denied any involvement like on his behalf and said that no, Schiller says that he, was not part of the project at that point and that he didn't give permission to put his name on this document. And so it's kind of interesting. There's things going in both directions now. There's like conflicting claims. And the Military Times also quotes somebody who knew Goudreau and was actually briefly an executive at Silvercorp, who says that Goudreau told him that they had the backing of the State Department for this whole project and that he had contacts in D.C. and that they were involved in this. And, he said this guy also says that they were planning on capturing oil fields and turning a profit from them. So like they were, Goudreau is apparently going into a little bit more detail to this associate saying, oh, yeah, we have contacts in D.C. We're going to capture oil fields. A lot of it sounds kind of far fetched. But, we do now, I think, have some additional reason to think that the administration might have been involved. This guy might have been just BSing, but we don't really know. We don't have a definitive thing. He's been saying all along that, at least to the Associated Press and stuff, that, Washington had no involvement. We tried to get their help, but they wouldn't. But, meanwhile, he's telling his associates apparently that oh, yeah, the State Department's given us, the go ahead and all this stuff. And so this is just kind of, I think some of these things are kind of now thrown into question, some of these denials about U.S. involvement. Of course, Trump and, Mark Esper and stuff have all denied that there was any American hand in this. But, again, I think that stuff has sort of been thrown into question. Another thing that I should mention that came out, too, last week is you had one of these Venezuelan defectors who was arrested in this plot. I think his name's Antonio Saquia. He claims that Juan Guaido, the opposition leader guy who is, the interim president who's, declared himself as that. He says that Guaido actually met with Goudreau in the White House back in March. And so that would definitely, I think, be the clearest link to the administration yet. But with this, I think we kind of have to take it with a huge grain of salt because the Saquia guy is still in custody. And he said this under interrogation, possibly under duress. And so, it may be true, but I don't think you can really treat this kind of testimony as reliable when it's somebody in custody like that. I'm not sure, what his motivations are. He's probably trying to say what is going to please his captors or whatever. So, things keep trickling out about this, but this last thing about this defector, I'm not sure if we can totally trust his testimony or whatever.
Right. Well, just a couple things. I think with the U.S.'s history, especially in this region of the world, of trying things like this, coup attempts and just interference in elections and training rebel groups, that I guess there's enough reason to that to certainly be suspect to begin with. And with the evidence coming out, being murky, I think we have to continue to be skeptical going forward of, just outright saying that, the CIA was involved. But there seems to me to be like another thing that they had to know about this, right? I mean, how terrible would the CIA be if they could detect a plot that was at least in part unfolding, with the name of Trump's bodyguard and in proximity to the White House? So I don't know. That seems to be a detail of it to me that's a little bit troubling, is that the U.S. government's response here wasn't to try to shut this thing down, but at the very least they just let it go on. And this is something that could have really destabilized a country that has already, millions of people on the brink of poverty, in part because of the government's incompetence, and then, because of the U.S. government sanctions. So, Will, I guess, do you have any evidence that, we're expecting to get, or that you're hoping to get, or is there any, thing that I don't know. What are you looking forward to about this story? Because obviously there's more details yet to be revealed, because it just doesn't make enough sense yet.
Right. There's still a lot of dots that have yet to be connected, and I would tend to agree that it's not credible that Washington says that it had no knowledge of this. Like, you'd think they would have at least caught wind of it, and maybe it was a situation where they were just going to try to let it happen, and just maybe it will result in Maduro's ouster or whatever, and trying to maintain some plausible deniability. But
right. Yeah. I'm not trying to say that, like, by ignoring it they thought it would work or anything like that, but the mere fact that they didn't arrest Goudreau, who this seems to be like maybe a Logan Act violation, or I don't know, overthrow, plotting a coup to overthrow a elected leader of a foreign country certainly cannot be something that the U.S. approves of as happening on our soil. And so to just let this goes on seems problematic, especially since, maybe tipping off Maduro to it and, kind of publicly saying like, hey, Maduro, there's a potential that there's a U.S. company called Silver Corp that's looking at a coup. And that seems like in most cases it would have shut it down. Although maybe that's what happened with those leaked stories that came out beforehand. Right. And they went ahead with it anyways. But it certainly seems like there's more the U.S. could have done to stop this. And again, I just imagine they had to have known about just the way the CIA works. It would have to be a massive intelligence failure if they woke up and were surprised by this story.
Right. And yeah, in terms of evidence of what might come out, I know Nicolas Maduro himself and other administration officials in Venezuela there have been claiming that we have more proof and we have more evidence that's going to come out. But I'm not sure how reliable that is. I know that sometimes they do claim that kind of stuff, that, oh yeah, we have proof, and then it never ends up coming. It's never forthcoming. But that's something I would definitely like to see if they have more. I don't know, the interrogation stuff. Like I said, I'm a little skeptical about that, but I would be interested to see more of what these captured people say, what they claim about. Because some of it, for example, they had Lucas Denman, one of these Americans that was captured, and some parts of his testimony have been corroborated by Goudreau and some of the other reporting. And so it's not just inherently wrong because it comes from an interrogation. But so it might, we should look for some of that stuff to come out, I guess.
So one of the stories that we've really been covering on the show over these weeks that we've been in quarantine, Will, is about the coronavirus outbreak on the U.S. Navy ships and how that's impacting the U.S. military and consequences of that, including, at least so far, one dead sailor on the USS Theodore Roosevelt. So let us know what's going on now with that aircraft carrier. Have they finally gotten that outbreak cleaned up?
Yeah, no, it doesn't seem so. I think last week we had I think initially 5 people were reinfected on the Roosevelt, and the Roosevelt had I think did you say 1,000 people, over 1,000 sailors that were infected out of the 5,000 person crew? One guy died.
I think it was about 1,200 in total were infected, 1 dead and 7 in serious condition.
Yeah, and I think the captain himself was infected, and it was like the biggest outbreak on any of these Navy ship outbreaks. I think there've been like 26 so far, and we've covered quite a few of those. But it seems that even after like weeks of intense cleaning and sanitizing on the Theodore Roosevelt and offloading its whole crew in shifts where they were quarantined in Guam and stuff, 13 guys now have tested positive after returning to the ship. And the weird thing is, like I said, these guys didn't just contract the virus, they recontracted the virus. Like all 13 had already been infected and recovered. But now somehow they've tested positive again. And even though they were actually required to test negative twice before they were allowed to come back on the ship. And so somewhere between testing negative twice, and coming back to the ship, they got infected again, I guess. And they're apparently, at least some of them are apparently showing symptoms too. So it's not just like remnants of the virus in their system that might be giving a false positive, as I've read that, sometimes happens. No, like some of these guys are actually symptomatic again, like they're sick again. So it's not just like a false positive, at least in some cases. And it does seem like if you read about this virus, there's some weird stuff about it that like we don't really understand, like in terms of like how people recover from it, and whether getting infected actually gives you immunity, or for how long you were immune, or like, how long the antibodies work and stuff. And so there's a lot of mystery surrounding this. And it seems like this is just another example of like some of these strange things with this virus where these guys are getting reinfected. And it's really not clear how they could have ended up with the virus again. Like I said, they already went through several layers of screening, and there's all kinds of like sanitation measures that were taken on the Roosevelt. But, if this thing keeps getting hit with outbreaks, it's like, I don't know how it can ever really get back to normal operations. It's like it can't, stray too far from home if there's constantly, infected people on board. You also recently had the USS Kidd that we talked about, which has been forced to, just like the Roosevelt, was forced to divert from its mission and sort of abandon it. And so we are seeing ships on deployment be hit with this virus. I'm not actually sure if the Roosevelt had returned to its mission. I know it had a mission in the South China Sea it was carrying out when it had to sort of detour. I'm not sure how far it got back to normal operations, but I'm not sure when it ever can, when this virus keeps popping back up.
So, one of the points that I've made when we've talked about this story is that if, we were surrounded or an alien invasion happened and we really needed this military equipment, it would be, kind of unusable at this point. And, that seems like it should be a real problem. However, I guess in a sense, fortunately for us, but in a lot of ways, unfortunately, too, these weapons what all these, different weapons and aircraft carriers and destroyers are doing out there is pretty frivolous. And we have more examples of the Navy setting up, the U.S. fleet for frivolous operations. And I think you covered one of these stories at RT this week about a new deployment of U.S. troops to off the coast of China.
Yeah. So we've discussed this a little bit, but there's been a lot of activity in the South and East China Seas lately, the last couple of weeks and months. Recently there was a whole week where every single day the U.S. Navy and the Air Force were basically carrying out some kind of mission or operation or activity out there over the South China Sea. A lot of them pretty provocative, sailing warships through their territory that China considers its own, doing these show of force missions with heavy bombers. I think we've done 40 of those flyovers in 2020 already so far, and actually deploying new bombers over there in Guam, the B-2s. And all of this is clearly done with China in mind. It's all right there in China's backyard. But last Friday, I think it was, you had the USS Rafael Peralta, which is a guided missile destroyer, was spotted pretty close to China's east coast in what's called the Yellow Sea. If you look up that on a map, you see it's wedged right there between South Korea and China. So it's pretty right in their borders. If Chinese warships were that distance from the U.S. border, the U.S. coast, I think our reaction would be quite different from theirs. Would be more intense than theirs. And so this guided missile destroyer was spotted right in the Yellow Sea there, just as Beijing is launching this huge 11-week naval exercise where it's going to have 2 of its aircraft carriers out there, and a bunch of other vessels. And I guess they've kind of gotten behind on their training due to the pandemic. They set up this huge exercise to kind of make up for some of that, I guess. But the timing for the sail-through, for sailing this destroyer right there next to China's coast, is probably not ideal. It might not be the best time to have our militaries mingling so close right in the middle of this, massive military exercise right there in China's own backyard. And the Peralta, too, is the second destroyer that's been seen in that same Yellow Sea area since April. You also had another destroyer called the USS McCampbell that was seen there a couple weeks ago. And then, I think we discussed the USS Barry, another destroyer, was like making several trips to the Taiwan Strait, and it ended up being escorted away from these Chinese islands, at least islands that China claims. And so there's been a lot of activity out there in this region, despite the pandemic. Despite us having to turn around some of our warships and sail them back home because of these outbreaks. It seems like the virus is having a greater impact on the Navy more so than the other branches. I know that some of the other branches have ordered worldwide troop movement, like a halt to worldwide troop movements and stuff, at least major troop movements. And so you'd think the Navy might sort of follow suit a little bit and hang back and do less of these far-flung adventurous missions, on the other side of the planet. But, I guess that's too much to ask for.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the big point right now is that with all the coronavirus outbreak going on and how hard it is to manage on these ships, it seems like unless, this was absolutely necessary for the security of the United States, the smart thing to do would be to, bring these ships to port. Hell, maybe, you have upgrades and maintenance that you could do on them to improve the fleet. I know it was just a few years ago that the USS Fitzgerald and McCain had accidents over there as a part of that same 7th Indo-Pacific fleet that the U.S. has, because they just run the ships too much. The crews are tired and overworked, the equipment's tired and overworked, and that's why mistakes happen. And so to cut down on this, that would probably actually increase the strength of the U.S. military again, to the point that's something that we actually want or need, but they seem to not even be able to have these small insights. And there's this real I think feeling in Washington right now among the political establishment that it's time to be hawkish towards China. I mean, so many people have been worried for years about, having 1 billion Chinese and a growing and larger economy than the U.S., even though, we have a quarter of the number of people and, is still almost the same amount of wealth. That says a lot. We live a lot better than most people in China still, and that's really not something to worry about. But, they've really used this to ramp up the tensions here. And I think it creates a potential for very dangerous situations, especially if we have this coronavirus going on, and that's making it harder to get crewmen onto ship. That maybe you have tried to put less people on ships. Some people have coronavirus, so you have to send in replacements. It seems like it would make mistakes more likely to me, especially since if I were a sailor, I would feel pretty upset about being sent out in the middle of the pandemic on some pointless, mission around some rocks in the South China Sea for no reason. And so, again, that attitude probably isn't very helpful to morale.
Yeah, and it is worrying too. Like you're saying, the politics the politics behind this pandemic, like how politically they're trying to blame this on China. Like I know there was a State Department memo that leaked where they're instructing some of their diplomats and stuff to use these talking points, blame China, say they have a responsibility, and that we're seeing this sort of drive to blame them as we see this spike in military activity right outside of their coast. And so that is kind of worrying. You would hope and think that we've seen some of the other branches do. We've seen them sort of scale back a little bit and halt troop movements and consolidate a little bit. But it seems the Navy is still just as adventurous as ever.
Moving to the home front here, Will, we have a story about Michael Flynn, and he's a name that's been covered on this show a lot, including the last episode of the show I just did with Joanne Leone and Dan Wright, talking about how all this Russiagate narrative of falling apart. But there's this very particular part of Flynn's case that I think is very interesting and that you have an update for. So tell us what's going on with his plea bargain, and is it getting thrown out of court?
Yeah. So last time I was on, we talked about how the DOJ had requested to have all the charges drop against Flynn, saying that, there was no legitimate basis to investigate him in the first place and just how they should throw the case out. And usually when the DOJ does that, it's sort of the judge doesn't challenge it. It's sort of just a formality for him to officially close the case and, go with the DOJ's request. However, this time the judge, this guy named Emmett Sullivan, has decided to appoint an outsider, a retired federal judge, to argue against the DOJ on why the case should actually go ahead. And so I might have jumped the gun a little bit when I, like by all indications, Flynn's case was done with. Like the DOJ had requested it all be thrown out, and typically it would be thrown out after that. But no, in this case, the judge has decided that, he's going to appoint this outsider guy to make a case for why it shouldn't be thrown out. And Sullivan also directed this guy he appointed to look into whether Flynn should now also be charged with perjury for trying to revoke his guilty plea. Because he said that Flynn, I think on 2 separate occasions, had admitted to guilt to what he was accused of with like making a false statement to the FBI. And so he's saying that, Flynn is now perjuring himself by trying to go back and revoke his guilty plea, that he's saying, hey, you lied, or you're either lying now or you were lying then. But they're trying to at least ask the new guy to review whether he should be hit with perjury charges. And this guy that Sullivan appointed, the former federal judge, is named John Gleason. And he's already made it pretty clear that he strongly disagrees with the DOJ's position on the Flynn case. And so it seems he's definitely going to try to make like a forceful argument for why these charges should not be dropped and why the guilty plea shouldn't be revoked. It's actually kind of weird, too, because this Gleason guy, he wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post last week before he was picked to, appointed with this task. And he was basically arguing that the case should stay open. And just a few days later, after airing his opinion, Sullivan taps him to do just that, to keep this case going, basically. Like, it just seems kind of weird that he's like already made it known, like he's clearly coming to this case with a viewpoint and he's still picked to do it. It just seems kind of slanted to me, but I don't know. I guess that's maybe part of how this would work. It's like, an adversarial process or something where there are 2 people taking a side. But so like I said, though, we might have been wrong to say that the Flynn's case was closed. Like, by all indications, it was. But this pretty rare and uncommon move from this judge, could mean like anything could happen at this point, I guess. Flynn's situation might actually get worse now if they do decide to slap him with perjury charges over the guilty plea thing. And so, this whole thing, it looked like it was kind of, wrapping up and over with. But no, it actually might not be over now because of this decision by this judge.
Which is just really interesting, given the context of everything else going on around the Flynn case, where it seems that more and more evidence is being revealed that he was set up in a perjury trap. And, it's clear that the FBI had no reason to interview him in the first place. And it was more of a political vendetta against anything else. And of course, now we know who unmasked, quote unquote, Flynn, all those people on that list. I'm sure you saw favorites of the show like Samantha Power and John Brennan, James Comey and Clapper, but also the former vice president and current DNC nominee Joe Biden on that list. So
That's right.
A lot of interesting stuff going there. Will, do you have any comments or interesting thoughts on that? I'm asking. We've talked so much about Russiagate on the show, and this is such a big moment. I want to give you a chance to talk about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just think it plays into the whole theme of Russiagate, that we've covered on the show for so long. Just how incestuous and tied in the intelligence community was in this entire thing. I don't know. It's just, I don't know how much in-depth commentary I have on the unmasking part, but it does just kind of show just how grimy the Obama administration was in leading this charge against the Trump campaign and all these Trump associates.
All right, so I think along with like Russiagate and Syrian chemical weapons attacks, the story that we've covered the most as in the 500 episodes of the show, Will, has been the not civil war, but the war in Yemen, the very uncivil war there. There's a new story in the New York Times that's getting some attention today because it has a very truthful and very provocative headline, which is why bombs being made in America have been killing civilians in Yemen. And so having that in the New York Times is in part productive because it's exposing people to a very important truth of the war. However, I think the story is generally lacking. I don't think there's any new journalism on uncovering, attacks in Saudi Arabia that killed civilians with American bombs. They review some of the worst atrocities in Saudi Arabia, like the funeral bombing in October of 2016 that killed at least 150 people, a funeral in downtown Sana'a, killing and, just dismembering children in the attack, and along with 150 to up to 250 other people. The bombing of weddings and of a school bus. Again, these are all American-made bombs behind these attacks. And it does, go over that. However, the very unfortunate part of the article is that the bent is kind of like, yeah, but this is all Trump's fault, which, the war since 2017 is. But, as I mentioned, that funeral bombing was in October of 2016. That's during the Obama administration. And this article, it seems like an attempt to whitewash the Obama administration's role in creating the war in Yemen. It has an interesting, quote in here from Ben Rhodes, who was, the Obama advisor that came up with the blob term. So I think a little bit more insightful person on foreign policy than, say, like a Sam Powers. But, talks about how quickly the Obama administration decided to just go along with Saudi Arabia's war here. Was made, at the end in a very short period of time. He also, the article also goes over an interesting thing in the Trump administration, which I think is just an important insight, that the war has really been pushed by Peter Navarro on the basis that it creates jobs in the United States from weapons makers, which we all know, and something I've discussed on this show in the past is absolutely untrue, that the weapons makers actually create more jobs by selling weapons to Saudi Arabia. If they do, it's a marginal number, like, a couple thousand. We've seen millions, tens of millions of jobs be lost in the U.S. in the past just couple of weeks alone. And so, these jobs are nothing. And in fact, most of the jobs created are probably, office jobs for former generals and congressmen, so they could go lobby their former colleagues.
Right. Yeah, I did get a chance to sort of skim through this article. I want to really sit down and, read it more carefully. But yeah, it is interesting how they try to shift some of the blame, from the Obama administration to Trump as a sort, it's kind of a predictable move, I guess, from the NYT types. But it's interesting when the New York Times is the one themselves who reported that, the Obama administration had agreed to go along with Saudi Arabia on this thing, despite the fact that they knew that it would be, quote, long, bloody, and indeterminate, the war, like meaning they knew the war would have no outcome, that it would be a massacre, it would be bloody and long and terrible. But they deliberately and knowingly decided to go along with it anyway. So, that was the Times that reported that, if you can believe it. It's interesting to see now what obviously it's different authors, but still just what position the paper's taking now on this.
Yeah, and again, I just want to highlight that the position is clearly trying to cover up the Obama administration's role here. All the blame on the Trump administration is great, but unfortunately, this is a story that's not covered enough by the New York Times, and they don't go back, to their own coverage, as you point out that article. That the Obama administration knew that the war was going to be long, bloody, and indeterminate, but went ahead with it anyways. Will, I think that about does it for what we have this week. Again, Will Porter, staff writer over at RT. His Twitter handle is WKP_ANCAP. His Facebook page is Will Porter. I don't know. Do you have like a specific Facebook URL? Are you like Will Porter 7 or 9 or?
I don't. I do. I know I do. I have. It's Will Porter something, but it was like auto generated, and I don't remember it off the top of my head. That is probably something I should start giving out though, like when I plug my stuff.
Oh wow! This Will Porter 3150 with no comma there. So Will.Porter.3150. I can link to that in the show notes page for everyone. But that is your Facebook page, and you actually don't have like bylines on the stuff you write over at RT. But if you go to Will's social media pages, he tweets out or posts everything that he writes, and so it's very easy to find. And then make sure you click the share button, get his work out there to more people. This is a great anti-war ANCAP that's writing on all the current events going on in the world, and we're fortunate enough to put out these very small news stories from at least a little bit of that perspective. Certainly not from the statist college produced kind of just robotic media that will go along with whatever the establishment line is. So I really appreciate that. I'm glad to have you on the show every week, and let people know if you have anything else to plug. Are you still doing stuff with your Patreon page?
The Patreon's kind of dormant. Like I've not been trying to fundraise too much. Like RT pays me, and I should be trying to put myself out there more, do more, be a better businessman, I guess. But My Patreon, I think, though, is still in my Twitter bio. So if you go at WKP ANCAP, if you want to send me money, then feel free to do that, please.
Yeah, maybe you could bribe him to write some more articles when he's not working over at RT. Well, anyways, Will, thanks for coming on the show, and I'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Kyle. Take care.